Thank you, Sandy. Well, it's a pleasure and an honour to speak to you tonight. I was reflecting on my walk over from the Courtauld this afternoon about my relationship with the BAA, and one of the things that I think that I really value, and perhaps which BAA doesn't get to hear that often, but one of the things I really value, especially as a teacher at the university, is the support that the BAA has given to students. And I just kind of want to put that down now and say, you know, with the Ox Scholarship, with the student scholarships at conferences, and with all the study days and so on, I really think it makes a huge difference. And I say that not to kind of butter you up, because I know that the BAA audience is more difficult than that, but because I actually really mean it. What I want to talk about today comes out of a book that I kind of started a while ago, but have not progressed very far, as is often the case, which is meant to be a kind of a broad study of architecture in the Iberian Peninsula from the kind of late 12th century up to the early 15th century, moving across the entire peninsula, including looking at stuff from al-Andalus. And this is really material from the first chapter, but it's material that I've been kind of wrestling with, and I'm still wrestling with. And one of the reasons I wanted to speak about it today is to see what you think, basically, and to take advantage of your collective wisdom. There's going to be lots of looking at vaults, so I hope it won't be kind of make me feel dizzy or something, but anyway, at least you don't have to crane your necks. So, in July 1199, Alfonso XI, King of Leon, moved his court temporarily to Salamanca, one of the most important and cosmopolitan cities in his small kingdom. There, on the 31st of July, Alfonso confirmed a privilege whereby 25 labourers working on Salamanca Cathedral were exempted from paying tributes to the king until works on the cathedral were complete. Alfonso's renewed support was an important spur for construction, and his privilege was confirmed by Salamanca's bishop, Gonzalo Fernandez, together with the Archbishop of Santiago de Compostela, and bishops from the major cities of the realm, Oviedo, León, Astorga, Lugo, Tui, Ciudad Rodrigo, Orense, and Zamora. The list of signatories effectively constitutes a roll call of prelates overseeing major building projects in the Kingdom of Leon in the late 12th century. And looking back 30 years later, Lucas, by then Bishop of Tui, would celebrate it as a time, quote, when the Catholic faith grew in Spain and many great and sumptuous churches were built throughout the Kingdom of Leon. Most of those churches were still building sites in the years around 1199, and their construction spurred a truly remarkable moment of invention and experimentation in the erection of vaults and domes. These merit further attention, I believe, because they speak to important issues of invention, technology, risk and aesthetics in European architecture around the year 1200, and to the transmission of architectural ideas across regional, national and religious frontiers. They also raise issues of method that are especially pertinent to the BAA, and I have to say that I don't think I would dare to present this sometimes quite sort of geeky material to any other group in this country, but I've chosen to discuss it here because I love nothing better than looking at architecture with the BAA, because I hope that these buildings will be of interest to you, and yet perhaps in some cases not too familiar, and because I'll be grateful for your collective expertise in thinking through the problems and possibilities raised by these buildings, and especially in understanding their international contexts, and especially understanding what phenomena were particular to the Iberian Peninsula. So let me show you what I mean. Here we have Salamanca Cathedral. In fact, there are two cathedrals, you may know. The new cathedral here that you can see begun in the early 16th century with rather extraordinary vaults of its own. But I'm going to be concentrating, at least the first part of this lecture, on the old cathedral, which I've highlighted in red there, and you can see it here, together with one of the chapels off the cloister that you see here, which you can just about see the roof there. So, let me show you what I mean about this experimentation and invention in vaults at Salamanca. So we find, for example, rounded half domes and pointed barrel vaults in the eastern chapels, begun shortly before 1150. In the aisles, in contrast, there are domical vaults, made up of concentric rings of masonry, usually arranged in a circle, but on one occasion set in a quatrefoil pattern, as you see here. They were erected above slender ribs that in the eastern bay spring awkwardly from the corbels, presumably because the ribs were not anticipated at ground level. At about the same time as these aisles were built, probably sometime in the 1160s, the adjacent cloister was also built with a painted wooden roof, fragments of which still survive. Back in the cathedral, a domical vault was again employed in the square outer bay of the south transept, its great zigzag ribs supported this time by rather crude atlas figures. So you can see in the plan to the right, I just show you the location of where these photos are taken. This is looking up at the south transept towards the crossing, and you can see there the outer bay with this spherical dome vault and these huge ribs supported by these atlas figures. So clearly it wasn't anticipated that they would have these ribs at ground level. Meanwhile, the south transept's inner bay here has a regular quadripartite vault, a form that was repeated, albeit without caryatids, all the way down the nave, with the exception of the central bay, which is covered by a somewhat awkward rectangular domical vault. I hope you can see that this vault is slightly different from the others. The others the webbing is laid in the conventional manner. Here it's laid in spherical masonry courses. Perhaps the most extraordinary feature of Salamanca Cathedral is the dome at the crossing, which rises nearly 31 metres above the floor. Set over a drum with 2 tiers of windows and blind arcades, it is divided into 16 gored segments that generate a distinctive rippling effect on its interior. The Torre del Gallo above is no less memorable. Decorated and heavily built, it provides a form of top-loading that prevents buckling in the walls of the drum. So you can see that it's actually it's a 2-layer structure with a roof above. You can see here and there the dome below. So it's a very, very heavy structure, but which provides some kind of top-loading for these walls and stops them from buckling. It used to be thought that the dome and the torre were erected in the 1160s, following a donation in 1163 towards the cathedral's ciborio, which sound rather close to the modern Spanish use of cimborio to describe a crossing tower. But notwithstanding Gervaise's use of the term to describe vaults at Canterbury, in 12th century Spain, ciborio is more like to refer to a chalice, pyx, or baldachin than to a vault. And these alternatives are more consistent with the sums of money involved. So there's a donation towards, it's a relatively small donation towards the cimborio. It used to be assumed that was a donation towards the dome here, which dated it to 1163 or thereabouts. But actually, I think now the consensus is that's not the case. Moreover, if we look closely at the caryatids on the smooth pendentives, we can see that they were originally attached to ribs, like those in the neighbouring transept bay. So I hope you can see this. If we look at this caryatid here, at the bottom of the smooth pendentive, you can perhaps just see the ghost of a rib rising up behind him, and you can see it again here. And it seems that originally, in fact, there were ribs springing from these points, as they do in the adjacent transept bays. Together with partial remains of a domed roof, now hidden in the fabric of the tower itself, this suggests that the torre replaced an earlier structure. And this confirms Henri Predelier's conclusion, based on stylistic evidence of the sculpture, that the dome and the torre probably date the years around 1199, replacing an earlier structure. So still in some of the Anglo-Saxon literature, you see this dome dated to the 1160s, but I think the consensus, certainly in Spain and amongst French scholars, is that this dates more or less to the period around, the decades around 1200. But the invention of Salamanca's builders did not end here. Indeed, The same sculptors who worked on the Torre del Gallo seem to have worked in the San Salvador chapel in the cathedral's cloister. An endowment for requiem masses in 1243 serves as a terminus antiquem for the chapel's existence, but it's likely that it was finished 1 or 2 decades earlier. Its dome could hardly be more different to that in the cathedral. Here, the transition from square to dome is affected not by pendentives, but by large squinches. And while the centrally facing corbel heads below the vault springers, let me get you a detail of these. So there's just a comparison, the two domes built probably within a decade or two so of one another, and you can see some of the differences, but also the similarities. But if we look at the corbel heads below the vault springers, we can see that in all likelihood, an umbrella dome vault was originally planned. So if you look, it's quite hard to see, but if you look at the alignment of these heads down here, the heads all face directly into the centre of this chapel. But if you then kind of follow this line up and look at the capitals of these columns, perhaps you can see, I hope, that the abacus, they're slightly set at a different angle. And that's because clearly there's a change of plan in terms of how those ribs would run. Told you it was geeky. So as built, this dome is formed by 8 interlacing ribs. You can see them as 16 or 8, depending on whether you think of them as continuous. 8 interlacing ribs, square in section and richly sculpted, which rise in pairs to skirt the centre, creating a complex interlacing vault. Unlike in the aisles, the masonry is not cut elegantly in smooth concentric masonry courses, but is laid roughly in continuous courses that follow a plan defined by the ribs. So the masonry courses do continue all the way around the ribs, but they're set, and I hope you can see this in this image, at slightly different angles, but not in a very consistent fashion. Thus, in the space of 100 years, or perhaps more like 80, Salamanca's builders adopted a remarkable variety of different vaults and domes for square, rectangular and apsidal spaces. Rounded half domes and pointed barrel vaults, domical and quadripartite vaults, gored domes, and the extraordinary dome of the San Salvador Chapel. Now, as you might expect, scholars have long sought to identify the sources of these designs with varying degrees of success. There is some consensus, for example, that Salamanca's earliest parts are closely related to nearby building lodges at San Vicente in Avila, San Isidoro and Leon, and Zamora Cathedral. But there's rather less agreement on the sources for Salamanca's domical vaults, quadripartite rib vaults, or its sculpture. So predictably, Western France has been one focus of attention. And I know also that John McNeill, amongst others, has some ideas about this. And while it is widely acknowledged the ultimate source of the interlacing ribs of the San Salvador Chapel lie in the 10th century additions to the Great Mosque of Cordoba, scholars have variously connected the gored dome of the Torre del Gallo, which you can just see in the corner here, to domes in Western France, North Africa, Byzantium, the Holy Land, or earlier Spanish buildings, but never definitively. Now, given the scarcity of written evidence, and we really don't have very much for Salamanca before the, early 13th century, the search for sources can, of course, be useful, especially when combined with prosopographic evidence. We know, for example, that Salamanca's chapter included several university masters from or trained in Portugal, Galicia, and France. Not least amongst them was Master Ralph Anglès, as he's called, who, sometime around 1185, endowed the feasts of St. Thomas Becket, St. Eutropius, and St. Martha in the cathedral. And this combination of saints, particularly Eutropius and Becket, as well as his description as Anglès, suggests that he may have had connections with the domains of Henry II of England in southwest France, especially around Saintes. Another member of the chapter attended the Council of Venice in 1177, while Bishop Pedro Suarez de Deza, appointed bishop in 1167, had been educated in Paris or Bologna and consecrated in Rome. After he was made Archbishop of Santiago de Compostela, he accompanied King Alfonso IX to Toledo in 1194 and oversaw the completion of Compostela's Portico de la Gloria. So this is a chapter that's fairly well travelled, not brilliantly, but they had an opportunity to see a wide range of buildings and speak to different people. Yet even when contextualised in this way, the search for sources can be misleading. Often it overlooks questions of transmission. Even if they existed, for example, architectural drawings would, I think, have been wholly incapable of communicating the complexities of these vaults. So we cannot attribute much to Salamanca's well-travelled canons beyond the recruitment of foreign architects, or perhaps some role in shaping the architectural horizons and tastes of their peers. At its worst, the search for sources is reduced to listing buildings of diverse function and status, many from far-flung regions and often on the basis of just one shared feature. Such methods also often depend on deep-rooted assumptions and prejudices about cultural preeminence and presume a rather Whiggish model of stylistic inevitability. This is particularly the case with vaults, which are so profoundly implicated in definitions of Gothic architecture that in scholarly discussions they're often reduced to a feature indicative of architectural affiliation or progress, a symptom of Romanesque Gothic or transitional status. In the case of Salamanca and many other Spanish buildings, these powerful historiographical traditions presume that architectural innovation took place only in France or Islamic al-Andalus, that these influences were spread in some ill-defined way via the pilgrimage roads or reconquest, and that the triumph of quadripartite revolts was somehow preordained. Now, I don't mean to throw out all those ideas, but I think that they do need to be scrutinised. I suspect you wouldn't thank me if I spent the remainder of this talk roaming across Europe and beyond in search of possible sources for Salamanca. I do, however, want to look in some detail at the sources for the dome in the San Salvador Chapel, because these have so often been cited in discussions of the earliest rib vaults in Europe. But I want first to pause and consider the significance of variety and innovation in vault design. It's easy to talk about, but what are those kind of implications? Firstly, from a pragmatic point of view, one might suppose that the danger, expense, and difficulty in erecting vaults, especially in Salamanca where wood for scaffolding was not readily available, might act as an impediment to innovation. Or, if you flip that round the other way, alternatively that any innovations would only be approved if they offered clear advantages in these respects. Vaults are risky, as we know from Canterbury, and so making changes in the design comes with consequences. You need to be able to justify those changes. New formwork might also have to be made, and local masons retrained or expertise brought in from elsewhere, or indeed it may be that builders who came from elsewhere were simply accustomed to different building traditions. In addition, or despite these concerns, certain types of vault might carry prestigious associations or symbolic connotations, or they might just look better. So can any of these arguments be made for Salamanca's vaults, where different solutions can be seen side by side? The advantages of quadripartite vaults over barrel vaults are well rehearsed. By channeling the thrust of the vaults into the corners of the bay rather than along the length of the walls, they permitted Salamanca's architect to introduce a clerestory below the nave vaults, creating a much richer effect than in Salamanca's barrel-vaulted apsidal chapels, or indeed than in the dark and rather austere nave of Santa Maria la Mayor in nearby Toro, where barrel vaults were erected sometime after 1230. So here is Toro, which is which is a building which in lots of ways kind of acts against any kind of notion of a linear progression towards quadripartite vaults. In fact, in the aisles, quadripartite vaults were erected, and if we look at the piers in the nave, you can see that they were designed to take some kind of diagonal. But in the end, when the vaults were erected in the 1230s, they chose to erect just these rather plain barrel vaults, one consequence of which was that there was no possibility of including windows below them. But what of domical versus webbed vaults? The differences are somewhat slight in the rectangular bays of Salamanca's nave, and probably could not have been discerned when the masonry is painted. But there are some signs of structural weakness in the domed vault. So this is, I'm comparing this central vault, so I worry now how much you're going to be able to see the difference between this and the others, but this is the domed vault, this is the other ones. This view, it's this central one here. I think the point is, if you can't see a difference, that's in some ways the point I want to make. There's not a huge difference. And especially any differences in the kind of masonry would have been hidden when these were whitewashed originally. But there are signs of structural weaknesses. There are a few kind of cracks in some of these, in this compartment particularly. And one could make the case that the webbed vaults generate a more satisfying sense of longitudinal continuity. So that the ridge generated by these web vaults here and here, for instance, is lost in the domed bay. In the nearly square bays of the aisles and south transept, especially the outer bay where it's got a domical vault, it's difficult to see that there would be much difference. Although the apex of the domed vaults rises much higher than the formerets, though not as much as in French examples. So obviously one key difference between a quadripartite vault like this and a domical vault like this is that the keystone in this bay is considerably higher than the formerets, than the top of the adjacent wall, than it is here. But the aesthetic advantages of either are hard to diagnose in a space like this. So for better or worse, we might say that the use of domical vaults emphasises the integrity of the bay unit much more than in a conventional quadripartite vault. Admiration for this effect is implied by its imitation in the aisles at Toro and also the nave at Ciudad Rodrigo, the nave and aisles actually at Ciudad Rodrigo. And so here you can see Ciudad Rodrigo, the nave, probably completed sometime in the 1230s, and you can see it's got these high domical vaults with these very elegant ribs articulating their surface, and the same in the aisles. So this suggests in some ways that there is admiration for this effect, which seems to have been introduced at Salamanca. But elsewhere in Salamanca, the quadripartite vault does indeed seem to have triumphed. Aside from its structural advantages, it's also possible that quadripartite vaults acquired prestige in the kingdom because of their introduction at the west end of Santiago de Compostela. So the ribbed vaults, for example, in the ambulatory at nearby Carboero may predate those at Santiago. These are not actually the earliest ribbed vaults in the Kingdom of Leon, but it was these that are copied elsewhere, presumably because they borrowed kind of prestigious associations from Santiago itself. This is the seat of an archbishop that houses the relics of an apostle. And the ribs at Compostela were quite quickly imitated at places like Ourense Cathedral. Here I show you the presbytery vault and the these are the north transept vaults here. And as an aside, so the point is, if we look at something like this feature at Ourense, the sculpture here, it's absolutely identical to some of the stuff that you get at Santiago de Compostela, and it's consecrated in 1188, so pretty much the same year as the Portico de la Gloria is signed by Master Matteo, you have it being imitated here at Ourense. But my main motive for putting Ourense on this slide actually was not so much to talk about Santiago, but as an aside, just to show you these rather strange bits of sculpture in the vault. You can see that, first of all, the number of holes in the vaults, some of them kind of picked out either by being juxtaposed with sculptures or they're kind of emphasised by these little kind of florets, and it's the same in the transepts. And I'm trying to kind of puzzle my way through these. I've found slightly later French examples of these, but I don't know why you need so many holes. presumably you don't need all of them for lamps and things. So what are they there for? Were there acoustic pots or something up in the vault? There are examples of that elsewhere in the Iberian Peninsula, but that's a sort of a plea for ideas. But it's also slightly sidetracking us. So if we return to Salamanca and to its gored dome, we can see that it presents quite different issues to the domical vaults or quadripartite vaults that I've discussed so far. The dome and the crossing at nearby Zamora, which you see on the left here, which now with this new dating seems correctly in terms of the sequence to predate the crossing at Salamanca, probably constructed sometime in the 1180s. This certainly displayed the magnificent plastic effects of gored domes, so the architects and patrons of Salamanca had a chance to see this tried out in another church nearby. And this, in Eduardo Carrero has recently argued, was these kinds of gored domes that you get at Salamanca and Zamora was inspired not by distant Byzantine models or models even in Armenia and so on, as sometimes been suggested, but by gored apses of the kind that you see here at San Esteban de Ribas de Sil in Galicia, which he thinks of as being kind of half a dome. And there are lots of examples, of course, of this in France as well. So Carrero's argument, which I find very powerful, is that actually there are local near precedents for these kinds of domes. We don't need to go on some kind of trawl across Europe to find models. But gored domes may also have offered a more practical advantage because, as I understand it at least, their rigid structure meant that they required no scaffolding during the construction process. So because they're gored, at least in what I've been able to find out, and again I would appreciate your thoughts on this, but I've read numerous places, certainly reference to Byzantine gored domes, that these could be erected without the use of scaffolding, which, given the height of the dome at Salamanca and the fact that wood is always a problem in this region, presumably made it very appealing. The domes in Salamanca's crossing and in the San Salvador Chapel are at once very similar and strikingly different. Both have been compared, albeit not directly, with the great domes built in Al-Hakam II's extension to Cordoba's Great Mosque in the 960s. So here's just a comparison of some of the details. On the left, on the top, the crossing, and on the bottom, the San Salvador Chapel. So similar in lots of ways, but also very different. Both have been compared in different ways with the Great Mosque at Cordoba. And here at Cordoba, there were probably originally 6 principal domes with 3 different designs. In each case, the ribs are stone and square and section, and Pedro Marfil has recently shown that the central sections of these domes are in effect suspended from 8 wooden beams concealed above the dome. So this is something he published in 2004 when he managed to get up into the space between the dome and the outer roof and found these beams which are effectively supporting this central section, so this keeps going, of the dome before the mihrab. So there are originally 6 domes, I said. The earliest of these, over what is now the Villa Preciosa Chapel, and I've marked that in red there, has a gored central section and interlacing ribs. Next to it, over what is now the Royal Chapel, is a dome of similar design, or at least similar basic geometry, but it was covered by stalactite mucanus ornament, probably in the late 12th century. But the basic stone structure is unchanged. So I hope you can see, if you take away this kind of superficial mucanus ornament, it seems to be applied to a much earlier caliphal structure, which would have looked something like this. Juan Carlos Ruiz Souza has argued convincingly that there was once a similar dome on the other side of the Villa Viciosa dome, destroyed when a new choir was erected in the 15th century. So originally there would have been a central dome, which is this one, flanked by another dome here and another one here, which is now lost, leading up to the 3 domes that I'm going to talk about in a moment. There are 3 other domes in the Maxura, the area near the mihrab that was reserved for the caliphal retinue. Those flanking the central dome are near identical to one another, so that's this design and an identical one, which are located here and here. Their geometry is subtly different to that over the Villaviciosa chapel. And then there's the famous dome before the mihrab, with yet another geometric scheme. So we've got this whole series of domes, all with very slightly different designs, which in some ways is a kind of storehouse for designs for the next 2 centuries. In addition, I should point out 3 miniature domes in the dome over the Villaviciosa chapel, which are almost always overlooked, but which show that Cordoba's architects were interested in yet further variety and also in issues of scale, and I'll come back to this. Regular Christian embassies to Cordoba in the Caliphal period offered numerous opportunities for northern patrons to witness these splendours, and Christian Andalusi borders remained fairly porous until after the great exodus of Arabic-speaking Jews and Christians that followed the arrival of the hardline Almoravids in the late 11th century. In 1146, Cordoba was briefly held, and the great mosque ransacked by a raiding party of King Alfonso VII, the emperor, but by 1149 it was under control of the Almohads, the even more hardline successors of the Almoravids, as the dominant Islamic power in the peninsula. Even then, however, diplomatic channels remained open, and in the summer of 1191, King Alfonso IX of Leon made an alliance with the Almohads. Nonetheless, under the Almoravids and Almohads, the mosque at Cordoba was effectively closed to Christian visitors, and except for a few months after 1146, it would remain inaccessible until the Christian capture of Cordoba and conversion of its mosque in 1236. And this, I think, is really critical when assessing the impact of Cordoba on architecture in Salamanca or anywhere else in Spain or Northern Europe. So, if we say that we can't, if Cordoba, at least in the 12th century, and early 13th century was not very accessible, what about other buildings? What about, for instance, Seville's great Almohad Mosque, built in the late 12th century on a scale second only to Cordoba's mosque, and converted into a cathedral following Seville's conquest in 1248? Again, we don't know if it had domes like this. It was destroyed in the 15th century. But domes, similar domes with interlacing arches, survive in several Almohad mosques in North Africa. In an Almohad extension, in the Seville's Alcázar, and in 2 Almohad castles in the province of Alicante, there on the screen. But again, all these surviving examples were inaccessible to Christian patrons or builders in the late 12th and 13th century, and all are brick built. So it's highly unlikely that their builders could be responsible for the stone vaults of similar design erected in northern Spain in the same period. So these kinds of vaults, as we'll see, are being erected either side of the frontier in the late 12th century, but I suggest that actually there's not very much connection between them. Cordoba's magnificent variety of domes inspired other followers, however, and these were much more accessible to Christian patrons and architects in the 12th century. The tiny oratory of Bab al-Madum in Toledo, built at the very end of the 10th century, has 9 bays, each with a richly decorated dome with rotated interlaced ribs, sometimes described as a copy of Cordoba's domes. Bab al-Madum's domes are more like a riff on the caliphal models, their miniaturized form inspired by the mini-domes that we saw in Cordoba's Villaviciosa chapel. After Toledo's Christian conquest in 1085, Bab al-Madum and its adjacent palace seemed to fall into private hands, but in 1183 it was given to the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, and in 1186 was dedicated as the Church of Santa Cruz, the Holy Cross. Located right next to the main entrance to Toledo, Bab al-Madum and its domes must have made a powerful impression on visitors, especially when those domes preserved more of their original stucco and paint decoration. And you might just be able to see in this detail of one of the side domes, there's a little bit of stucco decoration and fragments of painted decoration which have never really been analysed. But there is a problem with thinking about this building as a model for something like Salamanca, because it's so small. Those domes are less than 2 metres in diameter versus the 9 metres of the dome in Salamanca's San Salvador chapel. To me, this doesn't make for a very kind of convincing model. So perhaps instead we should look to the Capilla de Belén in the Toledan convent of Santa Fe, built in the 11th century and donated to the Knights of Calatrava in 1210. Measuring just over 4.5 metres in width, this might seem a better model. except that it formed part of a private palace and was probably no more accessible in the 12th century than it is now. I've never got in here myself. Like Bab al-Mardoum and many other Toledan buildings, it is built of brick and plaster. So there's a question about the scale of these Toledan buildings, and there's also a question about how visible, how accessible they would have been. Now, it's possible that there was once a similar dome in Toledo's Congregational Mosque, converted into a cathedral in 1086 and destroyed after the 1220s, a building that was both prestigious and accessible, so something that you might think people would want to imitate. But I tend to think that Toledo is a distraction here, partly because there was a little building in stone there, and I think instead that we should look to the often overlooked octagonal oratory in the Aljaferia Palace in Zaragoza, which represents a significant outpost of Andalusi traditions in northern Spain. Built under Zaragoza's Islamic Taiful rulers in the second half of the 11th century, the oratory was converted into a chapel soon after Alfonso I of Aragon's conquest of Zaragoza in 1118. 5.5 metres wide, the space was quite clearly conceived as a kind of compressed version of Cordoba's Maxura, and you can see the kind of distinctive horseshoe arch and deep mihrab that it has, amongst other features. But unfortunately, its original dome no longer survives. What we see now is a restoration from the Franco years, which made it resemble the dome over the mihrab in Cordoba. But following detailed comparison with Cordoba's mosques, it's been recently suggested that the design was in fact closer to the flanking designs at Cordoba, as we see in this reconstruction. So there is the dome as it was restored in the 20th century. Here is the flanking domes in the Maxura in Cordoba, and here is a recent reconstruction of the original dome at Zaragoza, effectively based on those flanking domes at Cordoba. But I'm not sure this is completely correct. If we look at the vaults of the bath of the Aljaferia, destroyed in the 19th century, we see that they had a similar vault, but one that was built over a square base and turned 22.5 degrees. So you can see the basic structure is the same. It's quite hard to see at first glance, but it's just shifted with respect to our point of view. And in this respect, it's rather like what we see in the central dome of Bab al-Mardoum in Toledo. So if we, instead of the dome from Cordoba, if we take now this dome from Bab al-Mardoum and place it in the Aljaferia in Zaragoza, we have something which I think looks perfectly reasonable. And I have to say, I spent a very, very long time trying to play around with this. I was so pleased with my PowerPoint skills that I had a 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, my mind was spinning and I was kind of seeing these things move around the place. So I wonder if actually the vault might have looked a bit like this. I think on its own terms it's difficult to call one way or the other. But the reason that I think this is because if we compare it to the vaults of a number of churches with similar vaults erected in northern eastern Spain and just over the border in France in the late 12th century, and studied extensively in recent years by Javier Martinez de Aguirre, we can see that actually my reconstructed version of Zaragoza looked very similar to these nearby that wasn't what happened, sorry. These nearby examples. So here you can see Zaragoza, Cordoba's way down here, but in particular I'm looking at comparing it with Almazan here, with Torres del Rio, and with, well, in fact, 2 vaults in Oloron, just on the French side of the Pyrenees, which look very similar to that vault design. So these include the church of St. Blaise and Saint Croix in Oloron, San Miguel and Almazan, and the famous church of Torres del Rio in Navarre, where extra ribs have been inserted in an effort to reconcile the vault design with the articulation of the upper walls. You can see here we've got these extra ribs inserted. Amongst earlier responses to Cordoba and Zaragoza, indeed predating the latter's conquest in 1118, we might also include the crossing at Jaca Cathedral, probably built by the year 1100. So this again is close to Zaragoza, and I think points perhaps to Zaragoza as being a kind of important kind of stop-off point for the diffusion of these ideas in northern Spain and beyond. At this date, there's certainly no other obvious precedent for the square ribs that we find articulating the crossing at Zaragoza, though the upper chapel over the crossing of nearby Santa Cruz de las Cerros might be understood as a kind of parallel experiment with lightly moulded ribs that spring from the centre of the walls, not from the corners. So you can see this is from this upper chapel here. We have these ribs springing not from the corners but from the centres of the walls, as you can see here. We've got these large niches which effectively transform the shape of the chapel into something that's suitable for this spherical dome. And it's worth just noting, actually, that having looked at spherical domes with rib vaults at Salamanca, here we have a much earlier example of that within the Iberian Peninsula that reminds us in some ways of the interpenetration of all these different vaulting traditions. Javier Martinez de Aguirre has persuasively argued that the unprecedented cruciform ribs and cruciform plan at Cerros relate to its dedication to the cross, and the same allusions may also apply at Jaca Cathedral, which was dedicated to the Saviour, San Salvador. Building on this suggestion, Antonio Garcia has recently observed that the upper sections of the crossing at Jaca are made of a different stone. I hope you can see that here. And these, he suggests, are a later addition, and that originally the ribs would have been silhouetted against the open sky, casting dramatic shadows on the church below. This is a remarkably seductive idea, I think, all the more so because it echoes the chrismon carved on the tympanum of Jaca's western portal, a powerful statement of orthodoxy in a time of liturgical reform and anti-Islamic polemics. So you can see the same basic intersecting crosses prominently displayed on the tympanum. And yet, I have to say that the kind of pragmatist in me, let's call it my kind of BAA skepticism, struggles to see how this really could have been open in the Middle Ages, not least because Jaca's at the foothills of the Pyrenees, it rains a lot there. I don't see how this could be practical. Well, the jury is still out on the Pantheon in the Pyrenees, but the Christological associations of these vaults seems to me at least more certain. Over 260 miles from Jaca, the Church of San Millán in Segovia precisely replicates the dimensions and design of Jaca Cathedral, although the pattern of the ribs over the crossing is slightly different, even more emphatically cruciform, one might argue. That certainly seems to have been the perception in the Middle Ages. For the nearby church of Veracruz, or Veracruzes, also in Segovia, built some 90 years later, adopted the same design for its upper chapel. So you can see the earlier vault at San Millán, more or less copied here in a church whose associations with Jerusalem, with the cross, with the Holy Sepulchre, I think are undeniable. So this seems to have been picked, perhaps, that the Christological associations of this cross seem to have been recognised at Veracruz. Indeed, Javier Martinez de Aguirre has argued convincingly that in these churches with Christological associations, many of them with strong funerary associations and closely connected to crusading orders, these Islamicizing vaults may have referred not so much to unfamiliar buildings in nearby al-Andalus, so much as to Jerusalem and specifically to the Holy Sepulchre. So we read these buildings through the kind of lens thinking about al-Andalus, but perhaps actually we should think about them actually as alluding to kind of more exotic form associations with Jerusalem. And I just put up this kind of suggestive comparison here, a Toledo manuscript from the late 12th century showing the sepulchre of Christ under these kind of multiple domes. And here a section of Bab al-Madum, which was donated in 1186 to a crusading order and was dedicated to the Holy Cross. Perhaps buildings in Jerusalem are being seen through this lens of Andalusi architecture. It is in this context, presumably, that we understand the San Salvador Chapel in Salamanca, especially given the endowment for requiem messes in the chapel in 1243. So this is very strong funerary associations, like many of those other buildings that we've looked at. Its design might perhaps be related to Zaragoza or one of its followers, and as with those followers, there's no reason to suppose that its builders were Muslim. The enrichment of its ribs borrows from a broadly Romanesque repertoire, and can be compared with the enrichment of the ribs in the south transept of the cathedral, as we see here, or in the Portico de la Gloria at Santiago de Compostela. They're not the same motifs, but this idea of having these very, very rich ribs is certainly current. To me, at least, this vault looks like the work of stonemasons trained in a northern tradition who are struggling to adapt to a novel design, one perhaps imposed by the cathedral canons rather than the master mason. Now, this raises all-important questions of how these designs and ideas might have been transmitted. Flattened into two dimensions, these vaults look pretty simple, and similar geometric patterns can be found on any number of objects from the period. So I've just kind of picked out these examples kind of at random, but you can see if this is one of the flanking domes from Maxua at Cordoba. You can see, you start looking for rotated squares, and you can find them in all sorts of things. In tiles, which we know did travel a long way, indeed in textiles, like this banner from, associated with Las Navas de Tolosa, but which ends up at Las Huelgas probably in the early 14th century, in fact. Yet it seems to me deeply improbable that anyone contemplating such patterns would be inspired to convert them into a three-dimensional vault. We do, on the other hand, know that sometimes vault designs were transferred to other media, as with this lamp from Fez, but this hardly can be considered as something portable. There is, of course, a difference between objects and drawings that by themselves inspired monumental imitations. So we might think of Serlio's woodcuts. So to what extent can two-dimensional things actually inspire someone to recreate on the basis of knowledge only of the two-dimensional image, something three-dimensional? Or can we think of them as a kind of a form of record for someone who's already seen the monumental original or something similar? So how much of these are a way of transmitting or remembering designs that have been seen? To my mind, at least, it would be impossible for any two-dimensional drawings, such as these much later from Vienna, to inspire, at least on their own, complex three-dimensional creations, such as the 15th century vaults in Vienna's Stephanskirche. So yes, you might use these drawings usefully, but only if you understand what they do and how they function, and perhaps similar kinds of vaults. But that kind of scenario seems very unlikely for the 12th and 13th centuries. Certainly, we don't have any drawings of the sophistication of these, anywhere in Europe, really, but certainly not from Spain. So for places where there are no nearby models for similar designs, as in Vienna, Durham, or even Turin, I think we have to allow for the possibility of independent invention. The challenges and statics involved, after all, were not so very different, and the geometric principles, mainly kind of rotating squares and so on, were widespread. Such designs may have even been inspired by temporary structures, such as this willow house in a park near my house, near where I live, but which, made me think about the kinds of temporary structures that might create these kinds of patterns, or indeed things like tents, often overlooked. Not for nothing does the Arabic term kuba simultaneously describe a tent, a dome, or a mausoleum. And of course, as Krautheimer showed long ago, these structures may have been described orally or in texts. And distorted, and then we might imagine that people would try to recreate domes that had been described to them on the basis of those descriptions. And we can think of those recreations, depending on our kind of point of view, either as inaccurate or as sort of creative copies, inspired, in the case of the buildings I've shown today, by buildings in France, al-Andalus, or indeed from Spain itself. I want to conclude briefly then with another example of eclecticism at another well-known site, another contact zone for French and Andalusi traditions, the Royal Cistercian Convent of Las Huelgas on the outskirts of... Oh, no. There, thank you. On the outskirts of Burgos. Founded in the 1180s by Alfonso VIII of Castile and his wife, Eleanor Plantagenet, the Abbey Church has long been heralded as a harbinger of the Gothic style in Castile. Its stylistic affiliations and chronology are still somewhat contested, but most would now agree that in an early phase, the infirmary cloister, here, Las Claustrillas, was built by masons familiar with the region's rich Romanesque traditions. Construction on the church itself probably began around 1190, and by 1220, or perhaps even by 1203, it's been suggested recently, the eastern chapel's transepts and chapter house were complete. On the basis of its plan, elevations, pier types, and vaults, Las Huelgas has been closely associated both with churches around Laon and churches in the kind of region between Angers and Poitiers. The presbytery has the earliest sexpartite vault in the peninsula, while the vaulting in the square apsidal chapels gives them the dignity of an apsidal end and has this very elegant vaults that look like they're inspired by something from Western France. But one striking feature of all the vaults at Las Huelgas is their use of huge rectangular monoliths in their webs. And again, I'm not sure you're going to be able to see this certainly from the back, but the webs are constructed not by conventional ashlar blocks, but by vast monoliths that stretch between the ribs. And that's true in the chapter house here, in the presbytery, and in the apsidal chapels. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this is found only sporadically in places like France at this date, although it does become much more common later, for instance, in English decorated architecture, and I think it's found also in the crypt at Glasgow. But it's very rare, as far as I can determine, in France or England or anywhere else at this date. Yet it seems to be extremely common in northern Spain, and is found in a number of contexts. So this use of these monolithic slabs is found across Galicia and Leon in monastic contexts, churches, parish churches, cathedrals, and so on. Presumably, this was once covered by limewash, at least in the churches, so it was not very visible. So why was this technique used? Did it perhaps reduce the need for dense scaffolding or formwork while erecting the vaults? I would certainly be pleased to hear your thoughts. Meanwhile, just 100 yards away from the church of Las Huelgas, the Assumption Chapel, next to Las Claustrillas, seemingly belongs to another world. Built of brick and loose rubble, unlike the finely cut stone of the church, it was originally built as a rectangular space, but at some point was divided by a lambrequin arch. So it was divided, you can see here, by this arch, this lambrequin arch, which divides it into a narrow vestibule and then this square space. The vestibule was covered with 3 plaster Mulcanas vaults, which you see here, of a type found in North Africa in this period, precisely this period. Meanwhile, 4 awkward squinches transform the square chapel so that it could take an octagonal vault articulated by paired ribs. Strikingly reminiscent again of contemporary Almohad architecture, such as this dome in Morocco, but not so different either from some of the other designs we've seen looked at already today. Many questions remain unresolved in relation to this space. When exactly was it built and by whom? What was its function? But the challenge it offered, and this is what interests me, the challenge that the space offered and the solutions to those challenges were not really so very different from those in the lateral chapels of the main church. At Las Huelgas, at Salamanca and elsewhere, these technical and aesthetic traditions share the same kind of spaces. And for Spain at least, we cannot look at one without considering the other. Thank you.